Evening. It's now 6:01 actually. We're a minute late starting. And the regular session of the Planning Commission of the City of Lancaster, please come to order. Tonight, our invocation will be offered by Vice Chair Hall, and the pledge will be led by Commissioner Smith. Please stand.
In honor of Black History Month, I wanted to offer up a prayer by Mary Bethune. She was one of 17 children whose parents were once slaves. She became one of the untiring voices for global equality and understanding in the immediate years before and after World War II. And this, she says, "Father, we call thee Father because we love thee. We are glad to be called thy children and to dedicate our lives to the service that extends through willing hearts and hands to the betterment of all mankind. We send a cry of thanksgiving for people of all races, creeds, classes, and colors the world over, and pray that through the instrumentality of our lives, the spirit of peace, joy, fellowship, and brotherhood shall circle the world. We know that this world is full with discordant notes. Help us, Father, so unite our efforts that we may join in one harmonious symphony for peace and brotherhood, justice and equality of opportunity for all men. The task performed today, with forgiveness for all our errors, we dedicate, dear Lord, to Thee. Grant us strength, courage, and faith, and humility sufficient for the tasks assigned to us." Also, I'd like to offer up prayers for Keith Boyer. He prayers for his family, sympathy for his co-workers and friends. Also, I'd like to pray for our first responders, family, and soldiers that protect us. Amen.
Amen.
Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, both. Very nice.
Interesting, isn't it?
May I have the roll call, please?
Commissioners Diana Cook, absent. Miguel Coronado, absent. Cassandra Harvey,
Present.
Drew Mercy,
Present.
Sandy Smith,
Here.
Vice Chair Randy Hall,
Here.
Chairman James Vose.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. We have a new staff member joining us tonight. Ms. Reyes, would you introduce the young lady?
Members of the Commissioner, I'd like to introduce to you Sydney Yaceta. She joined us as a secretary in the planning section of the department, and she, in the months ahead, she will be trained to attend Planning Commission meetings.
All right, very well. That's great. Welcome, Sydney.
Thank you.
There's no refunds, by the way. Public business from the floor. If an individual is unable to stay for the entire meeting, we offer a short period of time to address the Commission on any agendized items. Do we have any early speakers?
None that have indicated, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Then any person who would like to address the Planning Commission on any agendized item or any item before us tonight would please fill out a speaker's card, which you'll find at the rear of the chamber, and give it to Mr. Ludicky, and then when that item is called, we'll call upon you to give your comments. Just so you understand a little bit of the rules of the road here, if an applicant wishes to make a presentation on a project, we typically give them as much time as necessary to present their case. Typically, then anyone for or against the project or having any other comments would be given a period of 3 minutes, and then the applicant would have a chance to rebut if they choose to take that opportunity. Also for your information, this commission meets twice a month, typically, usually the week prior to this meeting, where we meet with staff in this chamber. It's a public meeting, however. We do not deliberate. We do not vote. We typically take input from staff, get our individual questions answered relative to the proposed agenda. So if some of these items come up quickly and get acted upon by the commission, some folks would wonder why that is the case, and it's usually because folks have already had their questions asked and answered, and they're prepared to make a decision without further input. So the first item on our agenda tonight is the approval of the minutes of the regular meeting of January 18th, and we've had a change, a couple of changes, I think, on page 9 and page 2 that were handed to us, just typographical changes.
It's the 17th.
Hmm?
It was the 17th.
Well, it's the 17th, not the 18th, wasn't it? Yeah. I'm going to correct that, January 17th. All right. That action item is before us. What's your pleasure?
Make a motion to approve the minutes as corrected.
Thank you. Have a second?
A second?
Thank you. Anything further? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. The next next four items are new public hearings. Item 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, which are one-year extensions of tentative tract maps. First item 2A is tentative tract map number 67239. So without objection, public hearings open on this matter. Anyone care to hear a staff report? No? Do we have any speaker cards?
No, Mr. Chairman.
All right. What's your pleasure? Up.
I move that we grant a one-year extension to February 19th, 2018, based on the findings contained in the staff report and subject to the revised conditions list attachment to resolution number 08-04.
Thank you. Have a second?
I second.
Thank you. Anything further? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. The next item is item 2B, which is another one-year extension. This is tentative tract map number 69992. We've had, for the record, a couple of additions on the condition list, number 17 and 18, I believe. Is that correct? Is that right? No? Maybe that's D. I don't know.
So there were no revised conditions to this map. The requested water conditions were for the other ones. This one's in Quartz
All right.
Water District.
Very good. Thank you. So the public hearing's open on this. Do we have any speakers?
No, Mr. Chairman.
All right. What's your pleasure, folks?
I move to grant a one-year extension to January 24th, 2018, based on the findings contained in the staff report and subject to the conditions list attachment to resolution number 11-02.
Thank
Second.
you. Thank you. Anything further? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. The next one is item 2C, which is vesting tentative tract map number 62925. So the public hearing's open on this. We've had a couple of items. What was it? Something was added. Item 2C.
This one had the 2 water conditions added as requested.
Right, okay, very good, thank you. Any questions? Any speakers on this?
No, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. So what's your pleasure, folks?
I move that we grant a one-year extension to January 17th, 2018, based on the findings contained in the staff report and subject to the revised conditions list, attachment to resolution number 07-08.
Thank you,
Second.
thank you. Anything further? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
All right, and the last one-year extension item is item 2D, which is vesting tentative tract map number 66062. Public hearing's open on this item. Do we have speakers on this?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone care to hear a staff report? Nope? All right. What's your pleasure?
I move that we grant a one-year extension to January 17th, 2018, based on the findings contained in the staff report and subject to the revised condition list attachment to resolution number 0709.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Anything further? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. All right, item number 3, which is item conditional use permit number 15-08 and tentative tract map number 72539. So without objection, the public hearing is open on this item. We have speakers or presenter on this?
I have no cards, Mr. Chairman, but the applicant may be present.
Okay, I have some questions and concerns about this, so could we have a brief staff report then?
Good evening, Chair Vos and Commissioners. I have before you tonight conditional use permit number 15-08 and tentative tract map number 72534. Project is located at the southeast corner of Avenue J8 and features 67th Street West. The request is for a CUP to allow for residential plan development with a TTM for 109 lots, a 1.5 acre park, and 1 drainage basin. The park and streets in the subdivision would be private and maintained by an HOA. The expectations for an RPD is a project that is superior to traditional development, exchanging greater flexibility to meet allowed density for better design and amenities. A conventional layout in an R7000 zone would yield 4 units per acre. The applicant is proposing a density of 5.45 units per acre. In exchange for increased density, the applicant is proposing a private park which would serve as additional open space and recreational opportunities for residents. It is staff view that the RPD meets the goals of the city's general plan. The RPD would adhere to the adopted architectural and design guidelines, and the park would provide an amenity that would not be possible under the city's typical development regulations. Therefore, staff is recommending that the Planning Commission adopt resolution number 17-02, approving conditional use permit number 15-08 and TTM number 72534. That concludes staff's presentation. Staff is available for any questions.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions on this? Comments? This is an assemblage of 8 2.5 acre parcels in an area that's been 4 by about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in that quarter section. So you've got a considerable amount of fractionalized ownerships of adjacent parcels throughout that area south of Avenue J to K and from 70th to 65th. This is a proposed RPD subdivision within that without direct access utility service adjacent to it.
That is correct.
Okay. So when I reviewed the RPD requirements under 17.08.340, the RPD standards are very specific. For instance, RPD developments are allowed for unique project designs in areas with sensitive physical characteristics. I don't know what's sensitive about this, but hang on to that for a minute. RPD would reduce development problems in hillside areas. This is pretty flat. Actually, it's about 3 or 4% slope to the north, right? About.
Right. It's pretty flat. Yes.
And the exception for RPD is for projects that are superior to conventional development.
Yes.
So I'm not going to necessarily ask you to address those, but when I look at this, I don't see anything other than a very straight, not very exciting lot layout.
It's pretty
With-
conventional, yes. The amenity we are getting is the park, but that's,
Well, let's talk about amenities. The standard calls for a minimum of 15% of an amenity.
right.
The park, as defined in the staff report, is 1.5 acres, which is 7.5% of the gross. So it doesn't even meet that smell test. There's no paseos. There's no bike trails or hiking. There's bike paths identified on J8, which is a standard condition. That's not unique to RPD. And there's nothing that demonstrates the kind of housing that's proposed to be developed on this, which, the way I read the RPD regulation, it's more for an infill project, not something that's remote. Am I misreading that?
We do have a section that does talk about an RPD in the infill section. So we have two different areas in the code that talks about for an infill project. That does allow a little bit more flexibility in terms of setbacks and lot sizes, a smaller lot size as well too.
So what are we getting out of this, other than more yield in an area that is typically an R7000 subdivision area? Everything from...
You're right. Pretty much what we're seeing is just the park as an amenity. That's the only thing that really distinguishes this project.
So so the park is 1/2 of the requirement of the RPD regulation in acreage, and that's all that's being proposed for us to consider approval of it.
That is it. Yes.
Okay. All right. Have anything else to talk about on this? Maybe the applicant would like to talk to us?
Yeah, the applicant's representative is available. Yes.
Okay. Would they like to speak to us? Good evening.
Good evening.
You are.
My name is Imad Abujauda. I'm the civil engineer on the project. I'm also representing the owner.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Well, we've started this process with the city about 2 years ago. My client has been very successful with RPD projects in other cities. And the thought to create smaller lots at the time was appealing. to the market. So we met with the city back in March 2015, and we ran this idea by the planning and engineering. I believe it was Chana and Michel Cantrell. And at the time, they said, yeah, we can do that. There is a section 170804, I think it was, infill residential development that would allow us to do that as long as we can assemble more than 4 parcels that will add for more than 5 acres. In our case, we had 8 parcels with 20 acres. So they said that should be fine. Then under the RPD, it requires amenities. Specifically, it says trails, pocket park. So we went through about 4 or 5 designs in the past 2 years almost. We started with 118 lots, 1 acre park. Then we went to 109 lots, 1.5 acre park. Then we went to private streets and sidewalks. And we also went through the one of the RPD requirements is a curb bulb outs, curb extensions at the intersections for safety.
That's not necessarily an RPD requirement. That's a typical standard traffic calming condition for development in most every kind of subdivision in the community.
It is also written under the, I think, 340 section.
Right.
So we said, okay, great. So we did all that. Originally, we were not planning on HOA. Originally, the park is supposed to be a public park. Through the process, they said no.
Not going to happen this economic time.
Yeah,
that's
exactly. They said, no, it's not going to work. It has to be private. We said, fine. And then, so we increased the park size. We reduced the lots. We did the bulb outs. The HOA has to carry the maintenance of the streets and the park, which we understand. For the past 2 years, we've been processing this with the city under the impression that we were in compliance with the infill.
One opportunity that you do have, though, with any conditional approval is getting past us. So you need our positive vote to move your project forward. So what, I mean, this very straight grid pattern, what wonderful benefit do we get from that design compared to a standard subdivision in this rectangular 20-acre parcel that you typically would have designed?
I mean, more than the park, we don't have any. But we're also doing...
What about the adjacencies? The adjacent 2.5s to the west that your client probably doesn't own, and most likely it's fractionalized ownership. My suspicion is this ownership was able to gather all these parcels together and cobble them together so he could create a sufficient acreage to develop a decent subdivision, right?
Right. It won't work if they don't have 4 parcels anyway. There's a minimum in 5 acres. So
right. So if you have adjacencies to the due east that are 2 10-acre parcels, one of those 10-acre parcels has an approved tentative map, which is a straight R1 7000, 39 or 41 lot subdivision. All right. So you need to convince me why I should approve this RPD in that neighborhood, in that remote location, when you're not meeting the very minimum standards of the RPD application.
As a minimum, I would say at least we have a park. I have seen grids and grids of lots. I've personally designed and worked with the city where there are no parks. So at the least, I would say 1.5 acre park. And that location, I think, is a great amenity for our project and anything to the west. In fact, what
about the design of the structures?
We submitted architectural plans to the city in the beginning. They rejected them because they wanted more articulation, specifically recessed garages and patios more to the front.
So do we have that?
Yeah, we submitted that with our plans. And they accepted those. So I do know that architectural articulation was important, and we went through 2 designs to make sure that planning was okay with that.
So we don't have that in front of us, so. Okay, anybody else have any questions?
I'm just curious why we didn't go with what the code was. The municipal code said 15%, and it's 7. Is there some reason for that?
Historically, we've been pretty flexible on the 15%, so that's why we thought this was acceptable.
So should we visit the code and put it in there as
That's a possibility where
as a
we,
suggestion instead of?
yes, we could look at that.
And is the applicant correct that we have elevations and?
We do have conceptual elevations as well.
Right, but we don't have them to look at.
You do not, yeah.
Okay. All right, anything further? No? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And do we have any other speakers on this, Mr. Ludicky?
No, Mr. Chairman, no other
Right.
speaker cards.
Okay, thank you. So without objection, we'll close the public hearing. Frankly, my comments are, I'm not prepared to approve this tonight. I don't think we have enough information before us. I'd be willing to consider a motion to continue it so the applicant would have sufficient time to demonstrate their compliance with the RPD regulation, if they choose to.
That would sound good to me.
All right. So on my motion, I'll move to continue this matter for 60 days. So the applicant will have an opportunity to consider a modification to their design to meet the RPD standards.
Second.
Anything further?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the appropriate
Go ahead,
time, but I
you can
wanted
say whatever you
to
want.
follow up with what Vice Chair Hall was saying. I'd like to learn a little more about that ordinance. And to me, in my experience, regulation should be firm, and if they're not working, and look at how we can deal with that. But I'd like to do that so we don't run into this in the future.
All right. I'm sure staff will provide that.
Yeah, we can actually have a discussion about that if, well, let you vote first and then we'll talk.
Okay. You ready to vote? Please vote.
Okay, motion passes 5-0 to continue it to the regular meeting of April 17th, 2017. We might consider, and we'll take a look at how our agenda stacks up for March, if you want to have a brief time to discuss either at your agenda review or at the regular meeting, kind of some of the background of the RPD.
Yeah, either one, whichever fits the schedule best. Probably the staff meeting if it works okay.
Is it just Municipal Code 1708-340 that talks about the 15%, or is it another number,
No, that's the primary section.
primary section?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Next item is item number 4, which is tentative tract map number 73344. So without objection, public hearing's open on this. Do we have speakers on this?
No, Mr. Chairman.
We do not. All right. Okay. Anyone care to hear a staff report on this? No? No? All right. No speakers?
No cards, Mr.
All
Chairman.
right. Then without objection, public hearing is closed. What's your pleasure?
I move to adopt resolution number 17-03, approving tentative tract map number 73344.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Anything further? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. Next item is item 5, which is a public hearing on the modification of the building placement and setback requirements in the city's commercial zone. So without objection, the public hearing is open on this item. Do we have speakers? Mr. Ludicky.
Well, you have a presenter. I don't know if you'll have speakers.
Welcome. It's nice to see you again.
Presenter. Again, I've been there. Okay.
Joe, you don't need to set a timer on him.
Maybe you do.
Or
Maybe she does. I don't know.
carry on, Mr. Ludicky.
Okay. What's before you for consideration is the a proposed revision to the city's municipal code that would change the setback requirements and actually also establish some different design requirements for the commercial and the OP, or as we call it, the office professional zone. In doing that, it would also potentially affect the CPD zone because the CPD zone ties back in some ways to the city's regular commercial zone. In the staff report that I prepared for you, I indicated that the current setback requirements that exist in those zones were really established in the case of the C zone back in about 1987 and in the office professional in the 1990s. And what we're proposing here is really something that would shift that entire approach to something that's different. And it is in line with a lot of the changes that we're looking at and have been looking at in the city. When you look at the things that we did with our downtown specific plan, with the TOD overlay zones, even with the city's elimination of the minimum parking requirements in the commercial zones recently. And so you can read through the ordinance, but I really wanted to go through a PowerPoint to give you a little bit more background on visually what does that mean. If you look at what our current requirements are, and this, as you're probably aware, is in our city. This would be Avenue K and 10th Street West. And you see there a couple of shopping centers, as well as some other development that has occurred over the years. The Target Shopping Center, which was not entirely built under the current setback requirements, and the center that has both Lowe's and Winco in it that was built under those requirements approximately 10 years ago. And so that's a typical 30-foot setback requirement for buildings unless there's no parking between them and the street right-of-way, in which case they can go down to a 20-foot setback. That's really what the current requirements allow and call for. What we are proposing is that as we work towards trying to create, number one, a community that's a little more amenable to biking and walking, as well as provide additional flexibility and ability to develop sites to meet what market demands are, what expectations are of tenants, something that would, instead of using the setback requirement approach, it would establish instead a build-to line or a build-to area requirement. And how that differs from a setback is that a setback says you can't get any closer than this amount of distance to a property line or to a street right-of-way. A build-to line or a build-to area says, in contrast, you have to build at least that close. And that's what we have, for instance, in our downtown area. And what that does, obviously, is it creates a different type of environment and a different regulatory structure than the typical setback. If you look at what a build-to line would do, and these are not to scale, but it describes essentially what you would create along street frontages in the commercial and the office professional zone, is this series of build-to areas that says if you're going to build a new building or you're going to expand a building, you're expected to build towards that build-to line. Now, the way it's drafted in the code, it says we really want to get 50% of that build-to line built to on any particular commercial parcel. Now, if you were to have something like that happen in a shopping center that's already built, obviously you're probably not going to get to that 50%. But the goal would be to encourage them to get closer to it than what they currently have. So what you would have in that instance, and we have had discussions with people who own various shopping centers, if they were to build new buildings, where could those go? How could those be done? If you were to have, say, new buildings built in this shopping center in some configuration, this is what the build-to line would basically require them to do. You can see how that differs from saying you have to set back a certain distance. In this case, you push forward. Now, that does a number of things. It, I think, gives a little more flexibility to how to efficiently use the site. It also creates much more of a presence on the street frontage for new buildings that are built. Even if you were to get a situation where, say, you had new building or expansion of the target building, they would build out towards that same build-to line. So that is really the difference that you would see. But that brings with it a lot of other things to consider, and those are other provisions in the draft ordinance revision that you would need to also take into account. For one thing, we would expect that those buildings would orient to that street. If you look at the way things are done now, these buildings, for example, don't necessarily orient to the street they're along. They orient to the parking area. How they're treated along the street frontage is maybe not as much of a concern, but this would require that to occur. And it's not simply shopping centers that this would affect. It would also affect some of the older commercial streets within the city. Actually, if you look at what exists right now along 10th Street West, at least in terms of building location between, say, Lancaster Boulevard and Avenue I, or in this case up to Jackman, if you think about that build-to line being there and the idea that 50% of that has to be built to, you get a pretty good idea of how that would look in this particular kind of a setting. Those buildings are already built to that standard, but that's a good visual representation. So how would that affect an area where, say, that hasn't occurred? This is Avenue J, 15th Street West, over to Kingtree, and if this were to be adopted, they would also have this build-to line that's established along them. So if you were to have a building that was either new or was an expansion or a modification of an existing building, you can see how that would change the approach that those locations would have. Once again, it's different because it brings the building closer to the street. The existing setback requirement tends to try to push it away from the street right-of-way. As I mentioned, that gives a little more flexibility, but it also changes the visual nature of what occurs. And I think it's important to talk about that because building orientation becomes important. This is 10th Street West. Those of you who are familiar with it, this is just south of where the Target building is located. And you see this contrast. This is a building that actually sort of turns its back to 10th Street West. It's been there a long time. And I'm not denigrating that. I mean, they built it in accordance with the requirements. But if you look over at the building that's just south of there, although it's not up to where a build-to line would be, it orients more toward 10th Street West. You can see that difference. Now, simply because, and we've noted this in the draft ordinance, simply because a building backs up to or sides up to a street doesn't mean that there can't be things done to it that make it more attractive on a street frontage. We, using the city's adopted design guidelines, certainly attempted to do that with the Chipotle Starbucks building that's at 10th Street West and Avenue K. And if you look closely, of course, this is essentially the back of that building. The building itself orients its front entrances and everything towards the parking lot that's on the north side. But as you can see, there has been more attention paid to how does that building's frontage relate to the street? How is that treated? How is that dealt with? So, one of the things that I think needs to be discussed, because it seems really simple as we stand here and talk about it, is what are the possible outcomes of this revision? Because I would tell you that they're a lot more varied than what perhaps the current regulatory scheme allows. And my short answer is many varied outcomes are possible. Why? Well, you know, design's dependent on a lot of factors. It depends on the street design, the site location, the market demand, the types of tenants, as well as the regulatory approach. If you take an action that shifts that regulatory approach, and we think in this case it shifts it in the direction of more flexibility, but also more demand in terms of some of the design requirements, you're going to get different results. The prediction that I've made is that if you combine this type of a revision with what we did in the eliminating minimum parking requirements, I think you may get a shift in the type of development that you get occurring. And we do see demand for new development in places like the Toys R Us Center and some of those other places where they're very well located properties, and they have what you might consider excessive parking areas, and they're starting to look at, hey, maybe it's better to convert some of that over to productive use rather than a parking lot. So I tried to find some examples of the types of things that you could have occur. I tried to find those examples outside the city of Lancaster to the extent that I could. And really, the way the code is drafted, you could have either one of these scenarios occur. Now, it's probably going to depend to some extent on what your street design is like. Because obviously, if you have a street design that is more like this, you are going to find buildings and uses that are going to want to locate and orient towards that, because that's where, you know, that's where their customers are essentially. They're aimed at pedestrians. They're looking at slow-moving traffic. If you have a case such as you have on the right here, where you have very fast-moving traffic, a fairly wide street, even if you get buildings that are located relatively close to that street, they aren't necessarily going to orient towards that street. They're going to orient to where their customers are, the parking lot. If people want to know where these are from, this happens to be from Los Baños, a community in the Central Valley. This one happens to be San Bruno along El Camino Real. And I used El Camino Real a lot in these descriptions. Why is that? Well, because I've become a little more familiar with that area, and I think it's a really good example of how can you get different development along a street and what's going on. You can get the same types of buildings. Probably the key here is that even though this is a pretty wide, pretty fast street, they both have on-street parking. I think that makes a difference. We are considering how that in our street design affects adjacent properties. And if you have a build-to-line effect or requirement, you have the chance for those developers, those tenants, to maybe take advantage of that more so. Market demand is important. The building on the left is actually a hotel. I don't know if that's exactly the kind of frontage you would want to put towards a street, but I have a feeling that that has a lot to do with whatever the parking demand either is or what that tenant assumes it is. Immediately adjacent to it, you have another building, comes up to the build-to line. I think pretty pleasant looking, pretty nice development. The parking happens to be behind it. So that's a possibility. I don't know if the city will ever get mixed use vertical, but it would certainly fit within this same build-to-line approach. One other thing that we talked about in the code is that if you don't bring building up to the build-to line, can you bring other people spaces, eating areas, plazas, things of that type? You see that example kind of with this Starbucks here. And I'm going to come back to this a minute because there's a shopping center or commercial center that I think is very interesting to look at as we contemplate all of this. Once again, this issue of a building which has its major entrance over here but has a frontage that's really close to the street. This happens to be a Ralph's along Ventura Boulevard. If you look just to the west of that, you have that same thing, but you have windows and you have that kind of feel. And those are clearly different types of approaches. Let's talk a little bit about design trade-offs. The code likes to push the buildings to the street. And it says it wants, the proposal is to have 50% of that covered. This is an Office Depot. I think it actually occupies an old supermarket from what I can tell. But it's along El Camino Real, and you can see that it does a lot of the things that we would like. It's up against the street. It's got windows on this side. Its entrance is actually right here. It's very close to that sidewalk. But the trade-off to that is that that's the parking lot that's north of it. So you have a stretch of that parking lot where you're maybe not getting the visual effect that you would like, but that's one of those trade-offs. Is that building worth it to be that close if you get the parking area the way it's shown?
It's like an old American store.
Yeah, may well be. It's this roof that kind of gives it away, this thing.
Yeah.
So this is the final thing I wanted to show you. I think it's actually one of the best examples that I could find of how you could do this very well. And this is a shopping center. This is Havenhurst and Ventura Boulevard. And this is one shopping center. And you can see these buildings are pushed to the street. But as we saw previously, this building, which is the Ralph's Supermarket, actually doesn't front, if you will, onto here. This building actually doesn't either. It backs up to that. And you have a CVS store over here that actually takes a slightly different approach to how this is done. This is the corner of Havenhurst and Ventura, and you can see how this has been treated on the CVS. I don't even think this is actually a part of the CVS. I think it's a separate space. I base that to some extent on the fact that there's a real estate sign right there, but maybe I'm wrong. But there are some doorways, and there is some relatively good treatment. And I'm not so sure that this is a bad approach to how they did this. But I don't know if it's something that would commonly be done. But I think it's a good example at its best of what this could be in the way of a view. So,
go ahead.
So, full disclosure, I am not the proverbial tree hugger. However, the hotel example, that's my fear, because I think it tends to look sort of like a concrete jungle. Those of us that have served a little bit of time on the Architectural Design Planning Commission, that was some of the discussions we'd had in the past. So that would be one of the fears that I would have. Would there be something from a regulatory perspective that would perhaps push, or I guess I'd say make it a priority to have some sort of vegetation or?
The code would actually do two things. It would, number one, establish that the building orientation should be towards the street frontage. Now, obviously, that had that. If you look, the front door was there, and there were, two driveways into an underground parking area that looks like it could pick off unsuspecting pedestrians pretty easily.
I think I stayed in that hotel in San Jose once.
Oh, okay. But what the code does is it also ties back to, and this is the first time that there would actually be a legal link in the code back to the city's design guidelines. Now, staff has been using those for a while to help guide things such as the Chipotle building project and other things. But this would actually formally tie the code back into the city's design guidelines as a reference that would be used in looking at it. But you raise a really good point, because it's going to fall upon the approval authority, be that at a staff level, in the case of a site plan review, or the planning commission in the case of a conditional use permit, to make the final determination of, does this meet the intent of why the build-to line was adopted? So I'm going to say, to some extent, it depends on the people that will sit in your seats and these seats right here. There's guidance, there's qualitative approaches, there's design guidelines, but at the end of the day, yes, it's a bit of a judgment call on the part of the appropriate approval bodies.
Thank you.
And I agree with you. I wouldn't approve that either.
Yeah, I keep being reminded that I do live in a desert, but the desert can be beautiful, and I think that the more we take away some of the natural environment that, I don't know, if I want to live in New York City, I suppose I could have transferred there years ago. I like the beauty that the desert provides, and I think we should make sure we give consideration to that.
Our conventional thinking was bigger and bigger streets all the time. So I wanted to say, how can we move more cars, increase traffic by cutting off the street widening in the future by moving these buildings so close to the existing streets? I kind of know the answer, but I thought it would be a good idea to ask you about it, because we have the example of Valley Central Way moving more traffic even though we cut down the lanes. And I think that there would probably be people that would ask how that would be possible. And to be fair to Cassie, New York City is shutting down streets and building walkways in between them to make it a lot more friendly place to be. So can you address that? I mean, I'd like to see how, you tell me how the bigger streets are actually detrimental to what our plan is here, to actually make it more walkable. And
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I actually had that discussion with our city engineer about that. We had a discussion earlier today about how is the city looking at street design, and it's really beginning to look at all the factors that affect traffic flow and everything else. And, the more and more you look at it, things like traffic signals are as detrimental to traffic flow as anything else. People tend to think that improves traffic flow. Well, maybe in some ways at some intersections for certain movements, but by and large, there's always this trade-off on things. So what we're finding is that, the wider and wider you make streets, the less and less economically efficient they are. In other words, the more widening you put in, you get less return on that. It's the diminishing returns type of approach. So what cities are beginning to do, and what the traffic engineering profession is actually beginning to do in their approaches, is how do you use efficiently the right-of-ways that you have, and how do you allot space in those to do it? How do you take into account, for instance, the situation where you may widen a street to get additional capacity, but when you get to an intersection with that, you now have a longer crossing distance time for pedestrians and others, and there are regulations as to how much time you have to give people to cross streets. And that was recently actually changed to address the fact that many of us are getting older and we don't move as quickly as we used to do.
Is he looking at me?
So yes, there's always going to be this balance. The other thing that I think is important whenever you look at streets within an urban setting or even a suburban setting, streets can be for mobility or they can be for accessibility. And the more and more development that you get, you're far better off to approach your streets for accessibility rather than mobility, because if you try to do them both in one street, you end up with a street that doesn't do either one very well. So I think what you're beginning to see is an approach not so much moving traffic as fast as possible, but trying to move it as smoothly as possible. And that may sound like it's the same thing, but it is a different approach.
on the 50% on the setback or build-to line, that is hard and fast rule, or can that be around 50%? Because like the one picture we saw of the hotel, that Commissioner Harvey didn't like, that looked like they used their 50% to make a cave or something. And,
Driveways,
yes. So
like it's tuck under parking and that.
Yes.
in
very
my
simple.
mind, I'm trying to visualize this happening, and I think you've done a good job making it with the pictures, and it makes it more clear, but do we have to be so hard and fast with it? I mean, we just had an RPD that we had a hard and fast rule over that got set back so we can look at it. Do you think that, one of my main fears of having this type of thing was we were going to end up with regulations this thick like we did with parking? Can it be purposely wrote a little loosely, or?
Yes. The approach that we have taken in the recommended language to you is this. This is the requirement. However, here are cases where you can grant exceptions to that. And I know I won't speak for the city attorney, but I think that's more sound from a legal standpoint than saying, well, you need to do around 50% or around 30%. I think it's easier if you say, that's your requirement. Now, here are circumstances where the approval authority can consider exceptions to that. But it states the criteria for those and why you would want to do it.
But ultimately, the commission has the unique authority at the end to make the final determination.
Yes.
Can be appealed, but so
yes,
we can be as subjective as we choose.
Right.
Within the spirit of the way the regulation's written, right?
Yes. The other thing, and I tried to highlight it, but I think it's important to state again, I think where you're going to see the most effect of this approach is maybe not so much in new centers, although obviously it would affect that. I think what you're going to see is it's going to affect a lot more new development or additions to places where things already are there. And I think that in the same way that we see the elimination of the minimum parking requirements, providing more flexibility, more opportunity on some of those sites, I think this would continue along those lines and help with that also.
So when you get into the master plan for streets tie-in to these proposals, in effect slowing down traffic so they become more, the occupants of those vehicles in that traffic pattern become more susceptible to become business friendly, shall we say, and drive the economic value back to the city, all the city, whether it be business or government or the citizens themselves. That's really the idea that we're shooting for. Huh?
Yes, that's one of the important concepts that we're looking at as we approach our master plan of complete streets, is this whole issue of streets really ought to be something that provides value to the property that is along it. How does the arrangement of the right-of-way, so to speak, do that? And, of course, places change over time. You may find that one street configuration now may not make a lot of sense in 15 years, but you want the flexibility to be able to adjust to that. Lancaster Boulevard's a great example. Valley Central Way is a great example of that.
Or others with 116-foot right-of-ways seem a little excessive.
In many cases, yes, I would agree with you. But I think the key to that is to say what you're trying to achieve and then provide the flexibility to address those issues as they come, because cities evolve, places evolve, they change over time, and I think it's a little crazy to assume that the components of that shouldn't change.
You talk about the pedestrian access, if you will, to these buildings that are proposed to be moved forward to the building line, if you will.
Yeah.
I've noticed on some of the examples we've got some grade or elevation changes from the public sidewalk to the particular piece of real estate.
Yes.
I mean, those are engineering challenges
Yes, they are.
that have to be addressed. So if you're orienting your front door, in effect, to the public sidewalk as close as it may be within 12 feet down to 0 or whatever that envelope is, you may have issues similar to, is it Chili's?
Chile, yes, that center is a really good example of that.
That
But I think the key to it, and getting back to Randy's point about flexibility to that, someone on that sidewalk does have a relatively comfortable way to get to the front door of that establishment. And I think that's
and the rest of the buildings nearby.
And that's what we would look at wanting to do. We want to provide that opportunity because that makes your development or makes the areas along the street a lot more conducive to people who may walk or bike or take transit. And of course, it hasn't hampered anyone who arrives there by automobile, which is the vast majority. There are places to park and ways to walk to it also. So I think if you were to look at that, that's an example of the thing we'd like to aspire to. Now, granted, not everyone has those same parameters, but
in some of the examples you pointed out, it's clearly there will be opportunities to expand and develop more building opportunities, more retail, or whatever they turn out to be, depending
Yes.
on the site.
right.
It gives the community that much more flexibility in the product and services being offered
Right.
by the developer and by the ultimate operator.
Yes, and it tries to respond, of course, to that old real estate thing, which is location. You know.
And some of the uses that you typically see on a corner these days. On the one example, you've got a CVS, I believe, or Walgreens and whatever.
Yes.
And they're I'm careful using the word program, but the particular prototype at the time that project was presented may well change over time.
Yes.
And the building may easily move to the sidewalk in a location like that, ultimately freeing up more space for parking or other building development.
Yes.
As long as we can have some kind of flexibility, that's really the,
You said that there was a tieback. Can you explain that a little bit better? And do you think that the tieback to the code, doing this resolution, would help with infill development by making a person want to spend money to design something and then present it to the city, instead of the way it is now, where there isn't really some way they can point to it and say, see, this is what we want to do, and we don't have that in place?
Well, you have that in a I would say in an operating sense, because ever since the City Council adopted the design guidelines, we have used those as a guide to, our approach to site layout and building design and so forth. And I think you see the effect of that in some of the newer projects that have been done. However, what this would do is create a legal tieback to say, yes, that's a legitimate guide to go look at as a way to say this is how buildings ought to be treated, this is the way you should address frontage and some of these other things. And I think for someone who may not be as familiar with the city, that's important for them to have, so they can say, okay, what is the city relying on in its design approach, its qualitative approach, if you will. Okay, there's something it's relying on. I can go to that and understand what their desires are.
Thank you. It sure was interesting reading through it to see the process of how you had to plan it, looking at different places. And I've been tending to do that myself now. When I look, I go, oh, that's, you start judging how it's built.
Yeah, I can tell you this will drive your close family members crazy when you go somewhere.
Brian, one question for you on
Certainly.
the Exhibit A, which is replacement on the setbacks, you talk about, where is it here? I guess it would be number 3, where it talks about interior side yard and rear yard 10 feet were abutting residential zones. So is that vacant space or a building setback from the residential zone?
It's intended to be vacant space. I think the effect, if you push the buildings forward, much like we saw in the one example out of Encino or whatever community that is that you're going to find more of that parking area moving to the back. And you know, quite frankly, what we found over time is that tends to be a little bit less of a concern sometimes for adjacent residential users. They're a lot more concerned if you get a building, a wall, and then kind of this area that's under no surveillance of any kind. So if you can do it well with landscaping and parking and things of that type, I think that's a better approach. We haven't really recommended changing any of the side or rear setback requirements. I think they've worked fairly well in terms of our interfaces, but it's really focused on those street frontages of those properties.
What about the other stakeholders? Typically, we solicit input from the trade associations, BIA, and realtor associations, and any of the other, the principal commercial developers within who either have or will be proposing to develop in our area. Have we gotten any feedback from them or solicited them?
No, I haven't done any formal outreach with them at this point, but that's certainly something we can undertake.
Because that this is really the first reading of this, and so I would assume that further outreach will be undertaken before you really ask us to take a definitive action.
Yes, the intent of this evening was to try to give you an overview of what we were proposing in the code, so that as you reviewed it, thought through it, you would have some basis to go back to and say, is this what we're trying to achieve? But yes, we can certainly do some outreach to some affected groups.
Okay. Yep. And would you email the PowerPoint to us?
Yes, I will do that.
I should say, would Joy email that to us?
Yes, I'll give it to her if she promises not to clean it up and make it look better, because she has a tendency to want to do that.
Makes you look good.
Yes, that's true.
All right, very good. Anything further from the members? All right, then. Thank you. So this will be trailed on our agenda till next time?
Yes, we'll continue to place it on your agenda for the upcoming meetings.
All right, thank you. All right. That completes our public hearings, I believe. Or are the next items 7 and 8 considered public hearing?
You do have number 6 also.
Pardon? Oh, yeah, okay, but yeah, it's still okay. Why did I check it off? Can't read. All right, item 6, safe routes to school. Schools. That's still a public hearing, right? Okay. So the public hearing on item number 6 is open. Safe routes to school. Have speakers on this?
There is one speaker card.
All right, very good. Thank you. I tried to access, I accessed the website last week, and I was able to review this. 300, never how many pages it is. However, over the weekend, I couldn't access it. Now, it could be operator error.
Okay. It'll click through. Can we just expand it? Sweet. Okay. You get my presentation of this because our consultant, Ryan Snyder, is not able to make this meeting. It's a brief overview, though, of the Safe Routes to School Master Plan. This has been a plan that the city has been working with community partner, Antelope Valley Partners for Health, as well as the various school districts, West Side, Lancaster, East Side, and the Antelope Valley Union High School District over the past, gosh, I would say 3.5 to almost 4 years. So, why do a Safe Routes to School master plan? Well, in Lancaster, as well as any other place, there's two primary reasons. We want to make it safer for children to walk and bike to school, students actually, and we want to increase the number of those who feel safe enough to walk or bike. All good Safe Routes to School plans cover 5 E's, as they're called. Engineering, which is what do you do physically to make places safer and more accessible for walking and biking. Education, basically making sure that those people who are walking or biking understand what this is about. And although you may think that that is something that just comes about, I remember growing up that you commonly heard about how you safely cross the street, how you safely ride a bike. I don't hear a lot of that going on anymore, and it's a component that I think we've missed. Encouragement, obviously, make this fun and exciting. I remember friends of mine who walked and biked to school. One of the things they really liked was that they were with their friends. They weren't under control of their parents so much, and they weren't necessarily under control of teachers. That was their time, during that traversing back and forth. Enforcement, very important. We worked very closely with our sheriff's department because, quite frankly, there are places where motorists don't pay a lot of attention to the things that they ought to pay attention to. And if you want to really hear some great stories, and I use that term a little bit loosely, talk to any of the crossing guards that we have in this community. They can tell you some really horrific stories about people who don't pay attention to what's going on. And evaluation, how well is it working? The plan really began in July 2013. It had funding from one source. It lost that funding source. We were able to go back and get more funding from another source to finish it. That's a testament, and although she no longer works for us, she's retired. Elma Watson, if you may recall, our assistant planner, I give her immense amounts of credit for seeing a lot of this project through to where it's gotten. We really looked, and it was ambitious, 30 separate safe routes to school plans covering essentially the public schools within our city. How did we do these? Well, we would have SRTS workshops at every school. We had students, parents, administrators, teachers, crossing guards, and we would go over what is Safe Routes to School all about? What are the things that we take a look at? Our site visits, what's the situation at each of the schools? Excuse me, I should have gone to school mapping exercise also. Where's the school located? What are the primary routes that people use? And of course, going out and seeing what is out there right now. What's the condition of a sidewalk? Are there places that make it unsafe for a child to walk? And sometimes that's not just physical. We heard things about dogs, if there were loose dogs in neighborhoods, or maybe a vacant house that students might be concerned about they didn't want to be near. We found out, how do people get to school? We had surveys of the students as well as the parents, and we kind of tabulated those. Here's one thing that is not unusual for our community, because we see this, I guess, in a lot of communities as they tally this, but it's an important thing to understand. What we found is if you had one student walking or biking or rolling, as they call it, to school in the morning, you probably had two or three that were going home that way. So a lot of Safe Routes to School programs seem to focus on the morning, the trip to school, but what we found is we have a lot more students that are walking home in the afternoon. And of course, I think that speaks to the fact that you have a commuter population or parents that are not able to go pick them up. So we've tried to think about how are ways to deal with that afternoon situation as opposed to just the morning, where you seem to have a lot more attention being paid to it.
Can I interrupt you, Bob?
Sure.
So really, you analyze, the typical analysis would be the peak traffic periods in the morning. Mm-hmm. And somewhat disregarding, because there's not a peak traffic afternoon, 2 to 3 o'clock dismissal time for schools. However, your research now is telling you if you had 15 children walking in the morning, you might have 45 walking in the afternoon.
Correct. And another thing, kind of speaking to your point, we get a lot of focus in the morning, I think, because of drop-off and things. But students actually, they arrive at different times in the morning, if you will. There's a longer period during which they arrive. When they're let out in the afternoon, it is right at that moment. And what we heard from crossing guards, from administrators, they have a lot more concerns in the afternoon because everyone is there at the same time. So, once again, do you try to work with the school to stagger release times? Do you think about other approaches to try and deal with that situation? One thing was also consistent in every school that we went to. What is the biggest concern that you have? And it always came down to this: parents. Parents that have already dropped off their own child or picked up their own child. Because what they want to do is get out of there as fast as they can. And that's where you get the stories from crossing guards about this parent ran over my toes when I asked them to stop, or they did this or they did that. So there's a lot of issues out there in that regard. And our schools deal with a lot of different situations. I'm sure, Mr. Bose, since you work with school districts, you understand that. But I think we as a staff got a greater appreciation for what our schools actually are dealing with. We also looked, obviously, at what's the historic bicycle and pedestrian crash data. That's not a great thing to have to look at, but certainly important as we consider what types of improvements we may want to look at doing. and we came up with suggested routes to school. This was based to some extent on what are the common routes that kids are taking. We find these out obviously from them or from teachers or from people who are in charge of manning gates that kids come into on foot. And then, of course, the plan map as to what are the types of improvements that we can see. Now, I want to highlight this a little bit because these were very instrumental. Even though the plan is still a draft plan, the city received something just shy of $6 million in a competitive ATP grant within the last 6 months. And that is really for improvements around 5 of our core area schools. Monte Vista, Mariposa, Desert View, Sierra, and I can't remember if it was Joshua or Sunnydale, but one of those. And what was really, really important in that grant competitiveness was because we had gone out and done the work, we had engaged our community, we had community partners, and we had all of this laid out. Even though the plan wasn't yet adopted, the fact that we had all of this was very, very important. So that kind of speaks to one of the things that I'll address shortly. But as we develop this plan, we have suggested improvements. It doesn't mean that we will go out and necessarily do that, but it's ways to address issues that we saw, be they curb extensions, mid-block crossing points, things of that type, linear improvements to help, provide a better situation for people who may be biking or walking, and also actually providing a greater level of safety for even people who are driving their kids to school. And then a program plan for each of the schools. This is obviously dependent on how involved parents and volunteers are, but a way to try to address the issues that were identified. Our next steps, we're going to continue to work with our school districts. One of the things that this program has allowed us to do is create a much better working relationship with our school districts as opposed to what we had before. We want the SRTS plan ultimately adopted by our city council. Our ADC has already seen it. It will become the basis of applying for funding for physical improvements that we want to do, and we're going to continue to figure out ways to monitor what's going on out at those schools so that if things are starting to change or if things are different than we saw during the plan development, that we have a way to try to address that. So this SRTS plan, it does align very well with the adopted master plan of trails and bikeways, and certainly what we're looking at, as we've discussed earlier tonight, on our Complete Streets master plan. What I'm really asking from the commission is we want you to take some time and look through the document. We've tried to catch as much as we could and make sure this was as accurate as possible, but as Mr. Vos noted, this is 300 some odd pages, so it's inevitable that there are probably things in it that are either typos or not quite correct. So we would certainly appreciate that. Also, any thoughts that you may have or suggestions that along this line would help tie the SRTS program even better into the approaches that we're looking at doing. So I think it's a very positive thing. It's taken a while to get to this point, but I believe it will do some really, really good work for our city going forward.
Definitely. Thank you, Brian. Talking about funding, and I don't recall now what the current resource at the state level for under the lease purchase program. But historically, there's been funding available for safe routes through the state allocation board. I'm assuming that's been addressed.
Yes, and actually the city, even before we did this plan, we'd been successful in some specific school locations in getting some funding for some improvements. I think what this plan really does, and I've mentioned this before, that what has happened as a result of the city's shift in approach on a lot of these issues, be they pedestrian safety issues or rethinking our streets and so forth. We have developed a reputation as a city who not only thinks about this stuff but seriously pursues it. And I can't tell you how important that is, because we have advocates, as I found out, for our approaches that are speaking for us when we're not present. We've done some really good, we've made connections, for instance, with a group known as Investing in Place, who also has connections with Antelope Valley Partners for Health. And I had a conversation by email with the director of that, a lady by the name of Jessica Meany, who was formerly involved with Los Angeles County Public Health. And she said, oh, I meant to tell you, she said, I was up in Davis at a seminar, and presentations were being made on how you improve biking, how you improve walking, how you make better complete streets. And she said, and I told them, I said, well, you need to go find Lancaster's stuff because you don't know what's going on there. She says, and that's a city that's not, sitting in the coast or anything like that, yet they are finding that these things can be done and that they're positive for their community. And I think that's very gratifying to be acknowledged in that way.
Definitely.
Especially in Davis, which is known for being a biking town. I went to
Yes.
school there.
Yes. I mean, that's almost synonymous with biking types of approaches.
Do they still allow vehicles there?
Well, yeah, they don't want you to have a car or anything, but
2- and 3-wheel vehicles without motors? Well, thank you, Brian. Very informative, and we will make the review, and that'll continue on our agenda again for next time. You're looking for an adoption in March or April? March or April?
Yes, one of those. If you're comfortable at your March meeting, by all means, because I think the sooner that we can get it to the city council, the better for us. But I don't want to rush you without making sure you get your review.
But all the school district stakeholders have all approved the draft document?
Yes, they were given the opportunity to look through it and give feedback on it. So we did get some from I think each of them, some more than others, but they've been given that opportunity.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So we're done with the public hearings finally.
Excuse me, Chairman Bose, there is a speaker card on that issue.
Oh, there is? I'm sorry.
It's Maria Paisano.
Oh, Ms. Paisano, welcome.
Hello. I want to come speak on this issue because it does involve children, and it's important to me to have children be happy and safe. When you think of safe routes to school, of course, you think of wanting the best for your kids, and a plan should be for that, for the best for your children, and not just your kids, but for the employees and everybody that works there and stuff too. But in the recent past years, the plan hasn't been for that. When we would, I was as a teacher, when we would try and take our children to school, the plan was, it seemed as if it was supposed to be for safe schools and the housing, which was that Prop 47 originally. Anything but that was going on. We weren't allowed to, they got rid of the buses, then we weren't allowed to even take our kids to school, to pick them up from school, because there was problems in the school. The kids were having problems with kids following them from school. I'm just trying to give my testimony here about things that have happened because there's a lot involved in it, okay? But even at school, it got so bad at school that the kids couldn't even walk to the bathrooms. They couldn't go without getting beat up or having problems. So the remedy for that, because the plan was for them to get hurt, and I'm telling you that was what the plan was. And because it was happening at our homes too. They brought other kids in, children in that were actually there to make problems for our kids. And so the remedy for that was to actually get kids. It wasn't just the kids, parents, people that were there for housing and things like that were overseeing that, were involved. I don't know, involved with them to cause problems, even with as far as trafficking goes, with our driving. If we were trying to have the kids be safely walking home instead of getting attacked, like their bike stolen, their phone stolen, even raped. I mean, I know a lot of people that happened to. And so instead of us, you would think, they'd want us to be able to take our kids home safely to the community. They would start pulling us over, giving us tickets so that we couldn't drive. And I know 3 minutes is like, there's so much like that this is going to happen. My concern is, and what I'd like to say about the plan is...
Thank you for your comments.
Man. Thank you, Maria. Yeah. It needs to just stop. We have to change the whole school system and who works there, because that's what the problem is.
Thank you, Maria. Any other speakers?
Yes, Jody Clark.
Mr. Clark?
Did I get that correct?
Yep, you got it correct. Though my dad is a volunteer crossing guard for Desert View, and we want to know, though, because we do live right across the street from a school, though, would this mean any modification to the properties, though, right in and around the schools? Because he would like to have, like, that tree taken out and stuff.
Yes, possibly. One of the things that we're looking at, I don't know which school he's near, but there are schools that are in areas where there are not sidewalks and other things, and we're looking at ways to be able to do that. But of course, the funding source is important to achieve
we live
that.
across from Desert View. Is there going to be, like, any houses, though, taken out? Because he's, like, 82 years old, and it's kind of, like, hard to move him.
No, the SRTS plan as drafted would not remove any housing.
But it would remove the trees and stuff.
It would look at providing safety features where they're identified as necessary.
Because I know a few years ago he wanted to take out a tree that's in front of our house because roots are pretty stacked up pretty much above the ground. And he came down here to see about getting permission to take the tree out. And the city, though, gave him a runaround. Though maybe this will get that tree taken out that he wants to see gone. Though, and let's see, and also though is just going to put up a permanent crosswalk for him, because the only way he can get kids back and forth across the street is actually he comes off a jaywalking area, though, where the kids can walk from to the corner of our house to the school parking lot, right where their crosswalk ends, but there's then nothing beyond that, and that is actually called jaywalking there. That's right where most of the kids would come across from the school.
What you may want to do is take a look at that particular section in the report and then provide your comments to staff specifically, and that would help them in analyzing what you're discussing here tonight.
Okay. So maybe I need to take this up to the next.
You can access it off the website, I believe, right?
Yes, actually, if we've got his information, we can make contact back with him.
Can you do that?
Yeah.
All right, very good.
Thank you, Jody.
Yeah,
We'll be in touch with you. Thank you.
Well, also I know some people here, so.
He says he knows people here. I know.
All right, anything else on this item?
No other speaker cards on this, Mr. Chairman.
All right, then. So this will go on, trail this on to another meeting.
I have a question. Can I ask
All right, very good. You've had your time.
I know, but that's what I'm asking you.
Ma'am, you've had your time, please.
I just wanted to ask where I can go to give full testimony on the situation.
New business then, we're going to hear a report and an update on the status of Medical Main Street. Mr. Ludicky?
At last week's agenda review
Mr.
meeting.
Ron?
Yes. Chairman, Bose, and Commissioners. At last week's agenda review meeting, David Sargent presented an update on the status of the Medical Main Street, covering the scope, approach, and concepts. As the plan develops, the Commission will have additional opportunities to comment. Tonight's staff is just looking for concurrence to move forward so we can begin the environmental review process, which is a next crucial part of this effort. And that's, staff is available for any questions at this moment, but that's pretty much what we're looking for.
All right, very good. We had a very detailed presentation at our last meeting last week. Anybody have any heartburn with allowing the EIR to move forward? No? Sounds like a consensus to me.
Okay.
All right, very good. Thank you. That was easy. What's that?
I think Shannon wanted to attend the whole meeting. I think she's excited that she got to spend time.
Did Shannon, do you have another 20 minutes you want to share with us or something? All right. So, streetlights, proposed streetlight design.
That actually isn't supposed to be heard tonight. We need to do some additional research, and it will be brought back to you when we have all of that information for you.
Okay, so we'll continue that or just take it off the calendar?
Just take it off, and we'll stick it on the agenda when we have all of the information to present to you.
Okay. Very good. We're moving right along here. All right. So, director's announcements. Well, number 9 is not number 9, but we'll call it number 9, shall we? Should we call number 9? That's number 9.
Yes, you can take that issue up under Commission agenda, and I have no announcements, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
So we've been handed, and we talked about this last week. It was suggested by some of the members that we should consider modifying our start times for our regular meeting from 6 p.m. to 5 p.m. on the third Monday of every month, commencing March 20th, 2017. So that's what's before us by a resolution.
Did we also discuss did we discuss an earlier time for the study session as well?
Yeah, the special meetings.
Special meeting.
We can set those times when we adjourn. It's not you don't have to set those by ordinance, right?
If I may, the municipal code only requires setting the time for regular meetings. It expressly calls out regular.
Okay, great.
That's it.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Good. All right. So, any further comments on this? Since you ladies decided we're doing this?
I think it's great.
I say we decided.
Move
I
forward
think
with it, yes.
I suggested that
You
maybe we
suggested, now we're
consider
going to
this.
decide. Okay, fine.
Not that I'm smiling big, but
I'm ready for a motion if you're ready to make it happen.
I'd like to make a motion that we move our regular meeting times beginning in March to 5 p.m.
Okay, and adopt Resolution 1706.
I second it.
Okay, it's moved and seconded. Any further comment? That was quick. No? Who are we to disagree? Please vote. 5 o'clock it is. All right.
Trained well,
5-0.
Chairman. You've been trained well.
Another. Hear that train coming down the track. What was that Johnny Cash song? Anyway.
Walk
never
the
mind.
line, or
No. It had something to do with trains coming down the track. What was that? Anyway, never mind. We talked about, or I talked about maybe last time, taking a look at the grazing restrictions in the R1 zones. Can we talk about that, or are we ready to talk about that?
Staff is not prepared to talk about it. Is
Okay.
that an item you'd like on your agenda for next time? And are you looking in the urban residential zones primarily, or are you also looking at the rural?
As far as I'm concerned, the entire city.
Okay.
So we can help support control of ambient dust in our community within our jurisdiction. Okay,
Jocelyn Squared will have something for you in March.
Jocelyn Squared. I like it. All right. Ms. Swain, Ms. Corbett. Okay, anything else we need to talk about on the commission agenda tonight? Nope, okay. Any public comments?
We do have one speaker card for public business from the floor, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
And I'm Jason Wayne. Now you.
Nalu, Mr. Nalu, is it?
Yes, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Jason Wayne Now. My apologies for seeming a little timid. You guys are intimidating, just a little bit.
Don't be intimidated.
Okay, I'll try not to.
As I mentioned to one of my colleagues, we all put our skivvies on the same way.
Right? Sometimes I try
Those that
jumping
wear
in
them, that is.
Sometimes I try jumping in them both feet. I am currently in a civil suit, and I came to the city council meeting to inform the mayor of it, being the tough decision that he was under. Maybe he would want some civil help in regards to placements or aids or whatnot. He seemed to turn it down. It has to do with the vote of the people, actually. The city of Lancaster has noticed me and my attorneys to inform me that they did not want public that the mayor would be issued as the mayor without the city's vote. I went ahead and proceeded with the court hearing anyways and forced the city to notify its people. Trump is my aide. You guys probably have memories of Trump going to court back to back to back for years, just speaking about abuses and such. I also picked him as the President of the United States of America without a vote, which seems strange because you guys all voted, right? How could that happen? Well, we devised through his corporation to physically go into court and demand every single vote per civil law. And he was approved as such, and the voters, they couldn't take over the vote. He was nominated president. By law, as he campaigned, he informed everybody that it is rigged, that they do not get a vote, that he will be the president. Every single day he took the podium, he let people know, hey, this is rigged. There's a civil suit going on. You guys do not get a vote. That was his whole speech about pretty much everything and giving people jobs. He has been to court. He has informed many people that he is my aide, that his civil action is that of my aide, and that he does not wish to be the president, but he will take the position to further aid me. With such notice, I figured I'd come in and let you know the mayor has signed a document being the same aide, and that is how he became the mayor. So I plan on sitting down talking to him. This is going to get to court, and I don't want to bombard you with it and to blindside you guys with such lawsuit.
All right, thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
All right, do we have anything further?
No more cards, Mr. Chairman.
No more? All right, thank you. Anything further from the members? All right, very good. So we stand adjourned to a special meeting for agenda review on Monday, March 13th, 2017 at 4:30 p.m. here in these chambers. Thank you all for your involvement and expertise tonight. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.